The laughter started before Naomi Carter had even set her briefcase all the way down. She heard it from the hallway, low and snide, the kind of laughter men allow themselves when they think a woman cannot hear the shape of what they mean by it. She heard the words "new bodyguard," and then she heard someone repeat it back with a snort, like the phrase itself was the punchline. Naomi did not slow her stride. She had spent 6 years in close protection work, 2 of them overseas, and she had learned a long time ago that the men who laughed loudest in a room were rarely the ones worth watching. The ones worth watching stayed quiet. She pushed open the door to the top-floor conference room of the On Group's Seoul headquarters and stepped into a wall of expensive cologne and unearned confidence. A dozen men in dark suits sat around a black marble table so polished it threw their own reflections back at them, and at the center of it, carved into the surface like a warning nobody had bothered to remove, sat a human skull cast in gold, catching the morning light off the window behind it. A skull on a boardroom table. She filed that detail away the way she filed everything, without comment, without expression, because showing a reaction was the first mistake amateurs made in rooms like this. At the head of the table sat the man she had been hired to protect. On Jun-ho did not look up when she entered, and that alone told her more about him than any dossier could have. Men who needed to prove themselves looked up. Men who already owned the room did not bother. His suit was midnight navy, cut close enough to suggest it had been made for no other body but his hands folded loosely on the table in front of him, a plain platinum watch at his wrist worth more than her last apartment. His eyes, when they finally lifted to meet hers, were a flat, dark brown that gave away absolutely nothing, and there was a thin white scar along his jaw that caught the light when he turned his head, old and precise, the kind of scar that came from a blade, and not an accident. "You're the new one," one of the men said, not bothering to stand. He was younger, broad-shouldered, the kind of handsome that came with the assumption that nobody would ever tell him no. He looked her up and down the way men like him always did, slow and dismissive, cataloging her size before he bothered cataloging anything else about her. They said they were sending protection. I did not realize they meant a woman built like she could bench press the building. The laughter that followed was ugly in the way casual cruelty always is, easy and practiced, like they had done this before to someone else and gotten away with it clean. Naomi did not flinch. She had absorbed worse from better-trained men than this. She set her briefcase down at the foot of the table with deliberate quiet and let her eyes move once around the room, cataloging exits, cataloging hands, cataloging who was armed and who was only pretending to be dangerous. "I was sent because I am qualified," she said. Her voice did not rise. It did not need to. "Whether that is a problem for you is not something I was hired to manage." Jun-ho's gaze had not left her since she walked in, and something in his expression shifted, not warmth exactly, but attention, the specific kind a man paid when something did not match the shape he expected it to take. He raised one hand slightly, and the room's laughter died as fast as it had started, cut off like a switch had been thrown. "Enough," he said. 2 words. The temperature of the room changed with them. The younger man who had spoken first, a lieutenant named Yoon-suk-won according to the file Naomi had memorized on the flight in, straightened in his chair, but did not fully lose the smirk. "With respect, boss, I've seen her file. Firearms, close quarters surveillance.
Fine credentials.
But the men who tried to kill you last month were professionals. I don't think credentials matter as much as build in a real fight, and no offense to her, but she is not built like a fighter." Naomi felt the old, familiar heat rise in her chest, the one that had followed her through every assignment where a man decided her body was a more useful data point than her record. She let it pass through her without touching her face. Reacting was what he wanted. Reacting was what all of them wanted, proof that the joke had landed somewhere soft. Instead, she moved. It happened fast enough that half the room did not process it until it was over. She crossed the distance to Yoon-suk-won's chair, caught his wrist as he reached instinctively to push back from the table in surprise, and used his own leverage against him to pin his hand flat to the marble, her thumb pressed into the pressure point below his knuckle hard enough to make him hiss through his teeth. It lasted perhaps 2 seconds. She released him just as fast, stepped back, and straightened her jacket like nothing at all had happened. Build does not stop a bullet, she said. Neither does an opinion. I am not here to be liked. I am here because a man tried to put 3 rounds into your employer's chest last month, and someone in this room decided competence still needed to be argued for. She looked around the table once, slow, unhurried. I don't argue. I demonstrate. The silence that followed had a different texture than the laughter before it. Jun-ho had not moved, had not so much as leaned forward, but something in his stillness had sharpened. The way a blade sharpens under a whetstone, quiet and exact. When he finally spoke, his voice was low enough that the rest of the table had to lean slightly to catch it. That will be all for this morning, he said. Everyone out except Miss Carter. The room emptied with the particular speed of men who had just watched their own arrogance handed back to them in front of their boss. Yoon Suk-won left last, cradling his wrist, throwing Naomi a look that was not quite hatred yet, but was clearly auditioning for the role. She did not watch him go. She kept her eyes on Jun-ho, because the men in this room were never the real threat. The real threat was always the one still sitting calmly at the head of the table. When the door clicked shut, Jun-ho finally rose from his chair, and Naomi understood immediately why the room deferred to him without needing volume to enforce it. He was not the tallest man she had guarded. He did not need to be. He moved like the space around him had already agreed to make room, unhurried, exact, a man who had never once needed to raise his voice to be obeyed. You embarrass my lieutenant, he said. He embarrassed himself, Naomi said. I only made it visible. The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, something more private than that, gone before it could be confirmed. Sit, he said, and it was not a request, though it was delivered without the coldness she expected. Tell me why the agency sent you specifically. I did not ask for a woman. I did not ask for anyone under 30. Asked for the best available protection detail in the country, and someone decided that was you. Because I am the best available protection detail in the country, Naomi said, taking the seat across from him without waiting for further invitation. That's not arrogance. That's the report you would have read if you'd bothered to open the full file instead of skimming the summary page. He studied her for a long moment, the kind of study that felt less like assessment and more like recalibration. A man discovering the map he had been handed did not match the terrain in front of him. That was the moment everything changed, though neither of them said it aloud yet. I read the full file, he said finally. I know exactly what you're capable of on paper. I wanted to see if the paper was accurate. And now, she said. Now I have 3 broken assumptions and 1 intact hire, he said. We'll see which one costs me more. Before she left the office that first evening, Naomi did one more circuit of the floor, the habit of a woman who never trusted a building until she had walked its bones herself. She found the stairwell exits, tested the emergency lighting, noted which windows in the executive wing faced the street, and which faced the interior courtyard where a sniper would have no clean angle. It was tedious work, invisible work, the kind no one thanked her for, because no one ever noticed the disasters that did not happen. She was cataloging the position of a security camera with a blind spot in its coverage when she heard footsteps behind her, unhurried, deliberate, and did not need to turn around to know who they belonged to. You're still here, Jun-ho said. So are you, she said, not turning. That tells me something about how safe you actually feel in your own building. He came to stand beside her, following her gaze to the blind spot she had already flagged in her notes. I feel safe enough, he said. I have felt safe enough for 3 years. Feeling safe and being safe are different things, and I have learned the difference costs people their lives when I confuse them. That's the first honest thing anyone in this building has said to me today, she said. He studied her for a moment in the low light of the empty hallway, the kind of look that assessed without intruding, and something in his face suggested he was recalibrating an opinion in real time. Most people I hire tell me what I want to hear, he said. It is easier for them, and worse for me. I'm not interested in easier, she said. I'm interested in you being alive next year. Part 2 began the way most dangerous things do, quietly, folded inside the ordinary business of a Tuesday. Naomi spent her first week learning the architecture of Jun-ho's world the way she learned every assignment, mapping sightlines, memorizing faces, cataloging which men in the building looked at her like an obstacle and which ones looked at her like a problem they intended to solve later, when she wasn't looking. Yoon Suk-won fell into the second category. He was polite to her face now, since the demonstration in the boardroom had traveled through the building faster than any memo could have, but she caught him watching her at odd moments, calculating, the way a man calculates when pride has curdled into something worse than embarrassment. She learned other things too, things not in any file. She learned that Jun-ho took his coffee black and drank exactly half of it before every meeting, the other half going cold and untouched on his desk, a habit she suspected had nothing to do with the coffee at all. She learned that he kept a single photograph in the drawer of his desk, not displayed, not hidden either, just present, a woman with dark hair and a direct gaze that Naomi only glimpsed once when he opened the drawer for a pen and did not quite close it fast enough. Who is she? Naomi asked, before she could decide whether it was her place to ask at all. Jun-ho's hand stilled over the drawer. For a moment she thought he would simply close it and change the subject the way powerful men usually did when a question got too close to the parts of them they kept armored. Instead he sat back in his chair, and something in his shoulders loosened just slightly, the posture of a man deciding, against his own instincts, to answer honestly.
Her name was Yuri, he said.
She worked for my father before she worked for me. She believed loyalty meant something even in a business built on betrayal, and she paid for that belief with her life 3 years ago, in a parking structure 2 blocks from this building, because I was late to a meeting and she went ahead of me to secure the route. He closed the drawer, finally, with a soft, deliberate click. I have not been late to anything since. Naomi did not offer sympathy. She understood instinctively that sympathy was not what he wanted, and possibly not what he could tolerate without the whole careful structure of his composure beginning to crack at the seams. Instead she said, "That's not a wound you've healed. That's a wound you've built a business model around." His eyes came up to hers, sharp, assessing, and for the first time since she'd arrived, something that looked almost like surprise crossed his face. "Most people offer condolences," he said.
I'm not most people, she said.
I'm the one standing between you and the next Yuri. If I don't understand exactly what got her killed, I can't stop it from happening to you. There was an evening, 2 days before the parking structure, when Naomi found Jun-ho standing at the window of his office long after the rest of the floor had emptied, watching the city go gold and then gray with dusk, his tie loosened for the first time she had seen since taking the job. She had come to deliver a routine security briefing and found instead a man who looked, for just a moment before he noticed her, tired in a way his public composure never permitted. "You don't have to perform stillness for me," she said from the doorway. "I already know what you look like when you're not performing it. I saw it in the boardroom the day I broke Yoon Suk-won's grip on the table." He did not turn immediately. When he finally did, something in his shoulders had eased, incrementally, the way a man allows himself to soften only when he has decided a room is safe enough to risk it. "It is difficult," he said, "to stop calculating who is watching. I have done it since I was young enough that I no longer remember choosing to start."
Someone taught you that, she said.
"It wasn't instinct. It was survival. My father taught me," he said. He believed a man who let his guard down even once was a man who deserved what happened to him afterward. I believed him for a long time. He was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke again his voice had gone lower, more deliberate, like a man setting down something heavy he had carried a long distance. "I am beginning to think he was wrong about that. I am beginning to think there is a difference between vigilance and never once being seen." Naomi did not fill the silence that followed with reassurance. She simply stood with him at the window, watching the same skyline he watched, and let the quiet between them do the work that words would only have cheapened. That was the moment, she would think later, when the calculation in her chest had started keeping 2 separate ledgers, one for the job and one for something she had not yet given herself permission to name. The danger arrived 4 days later, on a Thursday evening thick with a kind of humid soul heat that made the air feel solid. Naomi was walking the perimeter of the underground parking structure beneath the on-group tower, the same structure where Yuri had died 3 years earlier, when she felt it before she saw it, the specific wrongness of a space that should have been empty and wasn't. She had learned to trust that instinct the way her father, a retired Marine, had drilled into her since she was young enough to remember. She reached for the radio at her hip at the exact moment 3 men emerged from behind a parked delivery van with weapons already raised, and every calculation in her mind collapsed into pure, immediate motion. She was on him before she had fully processed the decision. Jun-ho had been 3 steps behind her, close enough that the first shot meant for his chest went wide when she drove her shoulder into him and took them both down behind the cover of a concrete support pillar, the crack of gunfire ringing off the low ceiling loud enough to hurt. Short sentences. Fast movement. The smell of gun oil and exhaust, and her own adrenaline sharp in her throat. "Stay down," she said, and it was not a suggestion. Jun-ho did not stay down. He came up beside her instead, drawing a pistol from beneath his jacket with the calm precision of a man who had done this before and would do it again without flinching, and together they returned fire in a rhythm that felt less like coordination and more like recognition. 2 people who moved through violence like it was a shared language. Neither had expected the other to speak fluently. One of the attackers went down. A second retreated toward the exit ramp. The third circled wide, trying to flank them from behind a row of parked cars, and Naomi caught the motion in her peripheral vision half a second before Jun-ho did. She did not think. She moved, closing the distance and driving her forearm into the man's throat with enough force to send his weapon skittering across the concrete, following the momentum into a takedown that ended with her knee planted between his shoulder blades and his face pressed hard against the cold floor. It was not elegant. It did not need to be. It needed to work, and it did. When the structure finally went silent except for their own ragged breathing, Jun-ho crossed to where she knelt, offering a hand she did not entirely need but took anyway, and for one suspended second, pulled upright too fast, she ended up close enough to feel the heat radiating from his chest through the thin fabric of her shirt, close enough to see that his composure, that legendary stillness the entire building organized itself around, had a crack running straight through it now, visible only to her. "You should have stayed down," he said, but there was no real command left in it, only something rawer underneath. "If I had, you'd be dead in the same parking structure as the last person you loved," she said. "I told you. I don't argue. I demonstrate." His hand had not let go of hers yet. Neither of them moved to correct that. The days after the parking structure moved differently, the way days always do after 2 people survive something together that neither fully processes until later, alone, staring at a ceiling. Naomi began finding Jun-ho in places he had no strategic reason to be: the small gym on the building's 3rd floor at hours she trained alone, the rooftop garden at dusk when she took her one unscheduled hour to breathe air that did not smell like marble and cologne. He never announced these appearances as anything deliberate. He simply arrived and stayed at a distance that was somehow both respectful and impossible to ignore, and eventually they began speaking, careful at first, then less careful, about things that had nothing to do with the job. He said her name differently than anyone else in the building did, she noticed, on the 5th evening they found themselves on the rooftop at the same hour. Not Miss Carter, the formal address he used in front of his men, but Naomi, low and deliberate, like the word itself required more care than the rest of his vocabulary. "You watch me the way you watch a threat," he said one evening. The city skyline behind him lit gold with the last of the sun. "Cataloging. Calculating. Do you do that with everyone, or only with me?" "I do that with everyone," she said.
"It kept me alive this long."
She paused, weighing whether the next sentence was hers to say. "But with you it stopped being only tactical about a week ago, and I have not decided yet what to do with that information." Something shifted behind his eyes, quiet and total, like a door unlocking from the inside. "I told myself hiring you was purely strategic," he said. "Best available detail in the country, nothing more. I have stopped believing that as of tonight." Neither of them closed the distance between them that night. It was not yet time, and both of them, in their separate disciplines of restraint, understood that some claims needed danger to survive them before they could be made honest. Naomi found herself, in the days that followed, doing something she had trained herself out of doing on every previous assignment. She noticed things about Jun-ho that had nothing to do with threat assessment. She noticed that he read the same page of a document twice when something was bothering him, and he did not want to admit it. She noticed that he always chose the seat in a room that let him see the door, not out of paranoia exactly, but out of a habit worn so deep it had become something closer to grief. She noticed the specific, private way he said her name when he thought no one else was listening, softer than the version he used in meetings, like the syllables belonged to a different, less guarded man entirely. She mentioned none of this to him directly. She did not need to. He seemed to know, in the way people who have survived violence together always seem to know things about each other that were never spoken aloud, and one evening on the rooftop, watching the last commuter trains cut bright lines through the dark city below them, he reached over and set his hand briefly over hers where it rested on the railing. Nothing more than that, no declaration, no demand, only the simple fact of contact freely offered and freely accepted. Neither of them spoke about it afterward. Neither of them needed to. The betrayal surfaced 9 days later. Buried inside a shipment manifest, Naomi had insisted on reviewing herself after the parking structure attack made her trust nothing routed through normal channels. She found the discrepancy at 2 in the morning, 3 names on a security clearance list that should never have existed, cross-referenced against access logs that put one particular man in the building during every window when Junho's schedule had been leaked to the men who'd ambushed them. Yoon Suk-won's signature sat at the bottom of the falsified clearance, small, deliberate, the kind of signature a man leaves when he assumes no one will ever look closely enough to find it. She brought it to Junho before dawn, and watched something in him go very still and very cold when he saw his own lieutenant's name attached to the leak that had nearly gotten him killed. "He was my father's man before he was mine," Junho said quietly. "I trusted him because loyalty was supposed to be inherited in this business, passed down like a debt. I was wrong. We confront him together," Naomi said, and there was no negotiation in her voice, only certainty. "Not because I doubt you can handle it. Because I have earned the right to be in that room when it happens, the same way I earned the right to know exactly what almost got you killed." The confrontation happened that same morning, in the boardroom where the skull still sat catching the light on the black marble table, where the laughter had started 11 days earlier and had long since gone quiet. Junho laid the falsified clearance sheet on the table, without preamble, and asked Yoon Suk-won to explain his own signature. The lieutenant's composure held for exactly 3 seconds before it broke entirely, and in the scramble that followed, in the desperate reach for the weapon he kept holstered beneath his jacket, it was Naomi who closed the distance first, catching his wrist mid-draw and redirecting the motion hard enough to send the gun skidding harmlessly across the marble and into the base of the golden skull with a sound like a bell. It was over in under 4 seconds. It did not need to be elegant. It needed to work, and it did. Yoon Suk-won was taken by Junho's remaining loyal men, dragged out still shouting justifications about debts owed to the rival faction he'd been feeding information to, confirming in furious, cornered detail exactly how deep the betrayal ran and exactly how close it had come to costing Junho everything. When the room emptied, when the boardroom returned to something resembling silence, Junho crossed to where Naomi stood, and for the first time since she had walked through that door 11 days earlier to the sound of men laughing at her, he did not maintain a single inch of professional distance.
"You said you don't argue," he said.
"You demonstrate." He was close enough now that she could see the exact place his composure had finally, completely given way. "I am done pretending what I feel for you is only gratitude, or strategy, or the residue of nearly dying together in a parking structure. You are the first person in 3 years who made me remember what it felt like to trust someone without calculating the cost of that trust first." Naomi did not answer with words. She reached up, closing the last of the distance herself, deliberate and certain in a way that left no question about whether she was choosing this or simply allowing it to happen to her. "It cost something to get here," she said against him. "It always does in a world like this." "It did," he agreed. Yoon Suk-won's betrayal would cost him everything the organization's justice demanded, and Junho would carry the particular weight of having trusted the wrong man twice now in his lifetime, a cost that did not simply disappear because the truth had finally surfaced. "But some costs," he said quietly, "are worth paying for what remains standing on the other side of them." He looked at her a moment longer, as if measuring exactly how much of himself he was prepared to hand over to the answer. "I would pay it again tomorrow," he said, "if the alternative was never having found out what you are." That night, once the building had finally emptied and the last of Junho's men had confirmed the perimeter clean, Naomi found him back in his office, standing again at the window where she had first seen him unguarded weeks earlier. The city looked different now, or maybe she looked at it differently. The gold light no longer just scenery but something that belonged, however briefly, to both of them. "I owe you an apology," he said, without turning around. "Not for tonight. For the first morning. I let Yoon Suk-won speak about you the way he did, and I said nothing until you had already handled it yourself. That was a failure of leadership before it was anything else. You didn't owe me protection from an opinion," she said, crossing to stand beside him. "I've survived worse than a room full of men underestimating my body. I've survived it my whole life, in rooms far less polished than this one, from people who never once had the excuse of a boardroom skull to blame for their manners. What you owe me is not repeating the mistake of trusting the wrong people, because I nearly paid for that mistake in a parking structure with you." He turned to face her then, and the careful architecture he wore for the rest of the world had finally come down. "I do not apologize easily," he said. "Ask anyone who has worked for me for longer than a week. When I do, it is because I have run out of other ways to say what I mean." "Then don't waste it on an apology," she said. "Say the other thing instead." His hand came up, slow, deliberate, giving her every opportunity to step back if she wanted to, and rested against the side of her face with a care that felt entirely at odds with the man who had emptied a magazine into an attacker without his pulse changing 4 days earlier. "I've spent 3 years building a life around the absence of trust," he said. "You walked into my boardroom and made every calculation I relied on look small. I do not know how to be a man who lets someone matter this much. I only know that pretending otherwise stopped being possible somewhere in that parking structure, and I have not wanted to go back to pretending since." Naomi did not step back. She had spent her whole career being the one who moved first, who acted before anyone else in the room had finished deciding what to do, and she did not stop now. "This is not the safe choice," she said quietly. "Loving a man in your position is not a safe choice for anyone." "I have never once offered you safe," he said. "I offered you honest. Naomi Carter, I would rather stand in danger with you than stand in comfort with anyone else in the city." She closed the last of the distance herself then, deliberate, unhurried, the same way she did everything that mattered, and when their hands finally found each other fully, laced together instead of merely brushing, it did not feel like the culmination of 11 dangerous days so much as the quiet, inevitable beginning of everything that would come after them. In the weeks that followed, the building learned a new shape of respect for the woman they had once laughed at in a boardroom. Naomi did not ask for the shift. She had never needed anyone's permission to be exactly as capable as she already was. But she noticed it anyway, in the way the men who once looked at her as an obstacle now looked at her as something closer to inevitable, a fixture of the empire as permanent and unshakable as the man at its head. Even Yoon Suk-won's replacement, a quieter man promoted from the ranks who had watched the whole reversal unfold from the far end of the boardroom table, made a point of standing when Naomi entered a room now, a small courtesy that meant more coming from someone who had witnessed the original mockery firsthand than it would have from anyone hired after the fact. She never once asked for the gesture. She had built her entire career on not needing anyone's permission to be taken seriously. But she noticed it, the way she noticed everything, and let herself, for once, simply accept a kindness instead of calculating what it cost. The golden skull still sat on the boardroom table, catching the light exactly as it always had, and now when the morning meetings gathered around it, there sat beside Junho a woman who had walked in as a punchline and stayed as something the entire empire had learned, in the space of 11 dangerous days, never to underestimate again. She kept her seat at his right hand not because he had given it to her, but because she had earned it the same way she earned everything, by demonstrating rather than arguing, by proving rather than asking, and when their eyes met across that black marble table each morning, there was no need for either of them to say aloud what both of them had already, quietly, decided to keep. If Naomi's story hit different for you tonight, If you felt every second of her proving them wrong without raising her voice, let us know in the comments where you're watching from tonight. Subscribe if you want more stories exactly like this one. Dark, slow-burning, and honest about what it costs to be underestimated by everyone except the one person whose opinion turns out to matter most. We'll see you in the next one.